Welcome. This is going to be the first of many videos on endgames. We're going to focus solely on pawn endgames, and we're going to go through a ton of them. And as you're going through these, if you don't readily understand why what's being played is played, please rewind. Rewind and view it a few times until you get it. And if you still don't get it, get out a board and practice it until you do, because if you don't understand the most basic elements of chess games, endgames, then you're not going to know when you're in the middle game how to simplify into these positions. Like, if you play an amazing opening, you play a pretty decent middle game, but then you've traded off your pieces and all of a sudden you're completely lost in an endgame because you didn't know these basic keys, that's your fault. So I want you to very, very much understand more than any other phase of the game, the endgame. Because if you have mastery of the endgame, you'll know what to trade and how to trade it. So let's start with this position that we have in front of us. Now, this is a key position that we can understand very simply. White cannot win this position. It is white's move. If it's black's move in this position, black is completely lost. So this is one of the starting positions of king and pawn endgames. So let's look at the most direct route first. After c7 check, king c8, king c6, we can clearly see that this is a stalemate. So with that being the case, we go back to the initial position and we try another move. Let's try king d5 to try to trick black. And now anytime you are studying endgames, and that's for all the endgame videos that you're going to see, you need to always not only study from the aggressive perspective, but also the defensive perspective. Because if you only think that you're going to be in winning positions, you're already failing in regards to studying endgames. I personally always learn it from the defending perspective. So if you can defend it, you can win it. Now, in this position, the rule for the defensive side is when the attacking side steps beside the pawn, you need to have the opposition and be directly in front of him. When the attacking side steps behind the pawn, you need to blockade the pawn and be in front of it. So now, if you were to step on either of these squares, white would go the opposite direction and win. So you simply need to remember the rule. When he steps beside the pawn, you need to be in front of him. So we go straight back. So when the king steps beside, we step in front of him, and now we have simply triangulated back to the original position, where if he plays king c7, we have ourselves a stalemate. Now this is a very, very basic king and pawn endgame, but you need to make sure you've got it. Now we're going to go through a ton of examples. Alright, next example. In the event that you have a rook pawn, the only thing that you need to remember with the attacking or the defending side is if the defending side can get to the queening square, then it is a dead draw, because there is no way for white's king to force this king out. In fact, I could even give white as many light squared bishops as there are squares on the board, and he still would not be able to win. And it's a very disgusting concept that is hilarious, but it is completely true, because black is completely stalemated in the corner after this position. So a general theme with rook pawns in endgames is that they tend to be drawish, and this applies to king and pawn endgames and king and rook endgames. Now, if you visualize in complicated king and pawn endgames, if you got a pawn on the outside of the board and there's just kings and the king has to run and go get it, the defending king, he's going to lose most of the time because the other side's going to attack somewhere else and just eat all the pawns. The same principle applies in knight endgames. But in rook endgames, where things can be defended very quickly and very easily, the rook's pawn tends to be a weak pawn and not very valuable in rook and pawn endgames. And we'll see in future videos as we go over these types of concepts. Okay, next example. So before I begin going through the moves, the first question to ask yourself, it is white to move in this position. Is this a win? So pause the video for a second, take your time, and evaluate the position as yes, it's a win, or no, it is not. Okay, in this position, black has the opposition. It's white's move. He will never lose it. Therefore, this game is a draw. Whoever has the opposition tends to be the one who gets what he wants. So in this case, the only way white can make progress is to play c3 check. And now remember, we need to stay behind the pawn, so when he steps beside it, we step in front of him. Stay in front of the pawn. When he steps beside it, step in front of him. Stay behind the pawn. When he steps beside it, step in front of him. Pawn, opposition. And now, stalemate. And keep in mind, if they don't do this, they try to trick you. If they're doing this type of thing, if you just remember the rule, stay in front of the pawn, and when he steps beside it, step in front of him. No matter what he does, as long as you remember that theme, no matter how much time you have left on the clock, you will be able to draw. I personally have beaten a 1600 and an 1800 in this dead drawn endgame from just shuffling the pieces very quickly, and because they were nervous, they did something stupid and lost immediately. So please master this. Don't think just because it's easy, oh, I'll have time to remember. No. You need to study this as if you only have seconds on the clock, because most of the time, if you get this ending, that's all you're going to have. Now, this is a good one. We got a knight's pawn here. Now, take your time and try to figure out, are you winning? Are you not? It's white's move. Okay, so hopefully you paused the video. After looking at this position, you need to go, what's the best way to try to make progress? Clearly, we're trying to queen the pawn. That's, our goal. So, most of you probably thought, I want to go to the side that has more space. You probably went king c6. Well, there's a problem with this move that after b6, after king a8, if king c7, that's stalemate. And if b7, that's also stalemate. So this is kind of a funny position where normally in the opening and middle game we try to take as much space as possible and have as many options. But in the initial position here, you actually want to go towards the corner to use the side of the board as a barrier to push the black king off of it. So when he goes into the corner, then we use the pawn. And notice, he can't use the corner to stalemate himself, so he must run. And then our king simply moves up, makes a queen, and we go on to win. If you do not know this ending, it is covered in a previous video on basic checkmates. Okay, next position. Well, in the starting position, it is black to move. So I want you to evaluate based off the knowledge that you've gained so far. Is it a draw, or does black lose? Okay. Black loses this position because, yes, he has the opposition right now, but as soon as he makes a move, he gives up the opposition. Oh, excuse me, it was white to move in the position, but if it's black to move, if king d7, we move king d6 and make progress. We'll see this in a future problem. But with white to move, you maintain the opposition, and it is, of course, a dead draw. So going back, if it's black to move, as I was saying, king d7, king d6, and now I am making progress to push the pawn up. And remember this theme, if you are the attacking side, you want to go the opposite direction in order to make progress. So now, any way he moves, either king c8 or king b8, Now, this pawn queens easily because I control all the key squares to usher it all the way home. So all the king can do is really just go back and forth until I make a queen. So hopefully that's pretty clear. So going back to this position after king d6, if king c8, c5, c6, c7, and when the king runs, we queen. Okay, next position. What's happening here? You're white. It's white to move. Clearly, we've been talking about this opposition thing a lot. You get the opposition if you play king g3. If you play king f3, black gets the opposition, and this is a dead draw. And it's so funny the way these things work. But the opposition is really of the utmost importance in whether or not you can make progress. So king g3, opposition. And keep in mind, if you don't play king f3, you know, black's got the draw. So your king has to be the one to make progress this way. The king leads the pawn. And I keep pushing him up the board. Now I can finally push the pawn. And no matter what black does, opposition. Now when he moves, we will be controlling the key square. And that's always the desired position that you want to get into, because there is no way for him to stop you from making a queen. So hopefully this video is making a lot of sense on the opposition is so important in just a basic king and pawn endgame. And that if you control the opposition, you are going to be the one who gets what he wants. In the defending side's case, a draw. In the attacking side's case, a win. So in this position, can black get to the corner? Say, well, I can prevent him from getting to the corner if I go here. But here's the problem. Black can use the edge of the board in order to make sure that your king can never get off of it. So as you're pushing the pawn, you're simply going to stalemate yourself. So again, if white decides to run this way, I'll get to the corner and it's going to be a stalemate. But if you go in the corner, we can either dance back and forth or you stalemate yourself. So again, rook pawn's a pre-drawish. Next example. Is this a win? Black to move. Or is it a draw? Okay. This position, if white could simply make one move, if he could go right there, that pawn's going all the way home and it's going to be a win. But with black to move, king... I hate when the computer does that. Thought it was black to move. King f6, we're doing just fine. h5. Happens again. Dead stalemate. So, I was thinking if this move, but the problem with this move is actually king g4. So if you push, you just take the pawn. And this is, of course, as drawish as drawn gets. So, emphasizing corner pawns, very drawish. Make sure you're understanding these themes. Okay, so in this position, we actually have to think a little bit on who's going to get the opposition, where's the best way to go, and why. So, of course, we know by now that the white king needs to be in front of the pawn in order to make progress. So I'm going to start moving him to try to get him in front of the pawn. Now, this is the key move. If you do not make the correct move with black here, you lose. There's only one move that draws. Now, if you play king e5, you lose because white gets the opposition. And as you're moving, as seen in a previous example, if I can do this, I can continue to get the opposition working all the way up the board. And when I get my king here doing the same thing, I'll queen the pawn. So going back to our position, after king e2, well, what about king f5? It suffers from the same problem. King f3, and again, I get the opposition. So you're asking yourself, well, what move do I make? It's king e6, exclam. Because if white does any move, say for instance, if king e3, now we get the opposition after king e5. Draw. And if king f3, king f5, we get the opposition, it's a draw. So make sure that you're understanding this concept, because just to emphasize the rest, king g3, staying in front of the pawn. And we've already talked about the theme here. Dead drawn. Okay, next up. This is with 2 pawns. So clearly, in these types of endgames, you want to try to win the pawn, but still try to get the opposition to win the game. If you can't win the pawn, and it looks like you're going to lose your pawn, you need to get in a situation to where you know you're in a draw on King and Pawn Endgame. So first, let's look at king g4, king g6, and it looks like that's just repetition. So what if it is black to move here? If king e6, king e7, king f5, he's trying to hold on to the pawn, but notice how we can slowly make him go away. Like if he keeps trying to hold on to the pawn, he actually ends up in that situation where he gave up the pawn, but he gets the opposition. And he would get a draw. So let's go back. In the initial position, king e6, and when we get here, instead of controlling the pawn, he just automatically gets the opposition. And as we saw, he gets the draw. Now most of the time, you should jettison or give away the pawn in order to get the opposition and hold the draw, rather than trying to hold on to the material. Because as we've seen in other areas of chess, like in the opening phase, say for instance the Queen's Gambit accepted, if you try to greedily hold on to the pawn, it's going to take so much and so many moves and so many resources in order to hold on to that pawn that the greed ends up causing you a lot of time problems, and then you're going to get hammered. So that principle in chess pretty much goes all the way throughout. You need to keep this in mind, that I would rather give something away to be able to hit my opponent in attack than use all of my resources to hold on to it to have all passively placed defensive pieces. You always want to play aggressively, even when you're defending and you only have the king left. If I can't make any other point in this video, that is a major point that you need to have as a takeaway. Okay, let's look at a few more. Alright, now we're starting to get more complex. How can I jockey to get to this pawn? And this is going to be the final example. So take your time. I really want you to try to figure it out. Now, if you go the most direct way, king d4, I'm going to get the distant opposition with king d8. This is one of those funny concepts, because now, king c5, king c7, king b5, king b7, and then we've got 3-move repetition. Otherwise, you may give black winning chances if you mess around too much here, because black's pawn's controlling that square, and then black is the one making progress. So quickly, if you're trying too hard to win these positions, it's pretty clear that bad things can happen. So going back to the initial position, instead of king d4, king c4 is the move. Now the idea is that black tries to play, say for instance, if he tries to go around, this situation is called a trebuchet. And that's an old school military weapon. You know, it like hurls giant rocks. I have no idea why it's called a trebuchet. I just know that you want to be the guy to move in this situation. And this is one of those like really funny looking positions, because Logically, it's normally the fastest with the mostest. Whoever can attack a spot the most and most quickly wins. But it's counterintuitive here because if you go directly for the pawn, black defends, and now it's stupid because you gotta move away, and then he takes the pawn and wins. So going back to this position, it's actually, instead of going towards the pawn, it's king c6. And now, if they attack the pawn, you're the one who gets him to move away, and we take and win. So going back to this position, king c6 to waste a move. What if black tries to do the same type deal? What if he plays king g5? Then we play king d7. And on king f5, king d6, forcing him to move away again where we win the pawn. So this takeaway on this trebuchet idea, definitely, if you didn't understand it, I was going through it. That's one you definitely want to practice, because wasting tempi or wasting half moves in endgames, it's one of those mind-blowing things. Like, we focus so much on not wasting time in the opening and middle game that when we get to the end game and I tell you, you've got one pawn left, you need to go ahead and throw away a move, but it wins. It's a mind-blowing thing, which is why the endgame is the most difficult phase of the game to study and master. So going back to our initial position, we got this king c4. What if he goes king d7? Okay, do we want to go directly ahead? No, because he's going to play king c7 and get the opposition. So we're going to go around. And notice our pawn is helping us. So we got all these squares covered. So okay, if he slides over, now, should we keep trying to go around? We come back and we get the opposition, so he's got to move. And now we're boxing him. King c6. And then finally, he's got to move away from the pawn. Weak queen. And that's where I'm going to end the first video on King and Pawns. Hopefully, you're getting some of these basic concepts down. You enjoyed the video. And pretty soon, we're going to start having Rook endgames, which are the most popular endgames to study because of all endgames, Rook Pawn endgames, and Rook and Knight versus Rook and Bishop, or Rook and Bishop versus Rook and Bishop. All different combinations of Rook endgames make up 1 in 3 chess endgames. So you need to have mastery of how to use the Rook and all of those keys. I just wanted to show you some of these basic King and Pawn endgames because they will occur, I would say probably, 1 in 10, 1 in 20 games. But you definitely need to know them, because if you mess up these themes, it's quite an embarrassing thing, especially when you start getting to the 1,000 rating range.